It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Leonard Maltin, a man who holds a unique place in the pantheon of film critics and historians, not only due to his numerous TV appearances and best-selling books, but also he's the first character to have appeared, or first person to have appeared as an animated version of himself in an episode of South Park. I think you can also safely say that there's no one alive today who has seen more movies than he has. He is quite literally hooked on Hollywood, to quote a title from one of his books. His writing is always extremely varied, highly researched, and charming. He's even written an entire essay about the use of music in the film Casablanca. And with books such as 151 Best Movies You've Never Seen, he's ensured that some of us have seen them and provided a vital service to our collective memory and culture and to future generations of film lovers to come. I'm delighted he'll talk today about Churchill and the movies, a subject which opens itself up to endless interpretation and on which it's fascinating to hear an American perspective. So please join me. It's a great pleasure for me. Genuinely, I've been looking forward to this for some time, and I think we're in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Leonard Maltin.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, John. I've had a sneak peek at John's documentary. You're in for a treat. You really are, to be redundant, use the same expression. When I was asked to do this, I said, well, just how many portrayals of Churchill have there been in movies and television? And I think the answer is countless. I truly do. And I was trying to think, well, who else would compete with him in terms of just sheer volume, sheer number of portrayals in films and television? I don't think anybody comes close. Now, if you limit the competition, so to speak, to just the last 10 to 15 years and include relatively new forms like miniseries and cable TV movies and such, then the docudrama, having now reared its head and certainly here to stay, would swell the numbers of films where you'd find Franklin D. Roosevelt, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and others. But Churchill tops them all. And so many, as I've been doing homework for this and revisiting a lot of films and discovering some new ones that I didn't know about, I think that if you are a British actor and you haven't been asked to play Churchill, it's kind of like being a British actor and not having gotten an offer to be in a Harry Potter movie. My family and I joke about that. How ignominious must it be if you're a member of British Actors Equity and you never got to play in a Harry Potter movie? The shame of it all. So what I've been doing the last couple of weeks is watching every great British actor of our generation, pretty much, tackling this challenge. And part of the challenge is that it's so easy to be a caricature of Winston Churchill. That's a relatively simple matter. We all know, the actors love bits of business, so having the cigar as a prop, great. Having the jowls, okay. The voice, the timbre of the voice, the bowler hat or the Homburg, all of those things make it, one step easier. I'm not saying easy, easier for an actor to inhabit the guise of the great man himself. Doing it well, doing it skillfully, doing it with the kind of nuance that makes the character really come to life. That's another matter. That's on a different level of merit and sophistication. And you will all undoubtedly have your own favorites. and I know that I'm preaching to very much the choir here. But when I started thinking about this and the whole phenomenon of portraying real life individuals of some celebrity on screen, I go back to my childhood and my youth, I should say, and the first time I saw a movie I genuinely love, Yankee Doodle Dandy, with James Cagney in an Oscar-winning performance as the great showman George M. Cohan. And it's framed, with bookended, as they say, with a scene of him having an audience with President Roosevelt in 1942, the early days of World War II, of America's involvement in World War II. And it's a scene that made a deep impression on me as a kid because you only see President Roosevelt from the back. You see him sitting in his chair, see the back of his head. They have an actor impersonating his voice, but you never see him. And as an impressionable kid, I thought, gee, what reverence and respect they clearly had for the office of the presidency, that it would somehow be unseemly to, have, an actor, impersonating him. How wrong I was. It was that case in that film. But in fact, in 1937, the real George M. Cohan starred in a famous play called I'd Rather Be Right, written by Moss Hart and George S. Kaufman, in which he indeed portrayed FDR. And that's recreated in Yankee Doodle Dandy. And it was a lightly satirical play about the populist president. And so irreverence was alive and well in the 1930s. Let's just put it that way. It's not a new thing. It's not a creation of our modern era. What's more, one of the most popular radio programs of that time was called The March of Time. Time being a pun because it was sponsored by Time magazine. And on that show, which dramatized news events on a weekly basis, FDR was, of course, a central figure for all the years he was in office and was very much imitated as a regular feature of the show. And one of the people who did that imitation was Art Carney. So FDR had his time in the show business spotlight. Mr. Churchill did not until some years later. Somebody will undoubtedly correct me if I'm wrong, but it was only after his death that he became, I guess, fair game for writers, filmmakers, television producers. And the many documentaries dating back to the 60s, the late 50s and early 60s. But Young Winston, which I assume most of you have seen, from 1972, was the first attempt at a biographical film, and that's, of course, based on Churchill's own book, My Early Life. And a young actor named Simon Ward was cast as Churchill and did a decent, creditable job. But the problem with that film is it's kind of like watching films about young Mr. Lincoln. Since we already know what happened to young Mr. Lincoln and what happened to young Mr. Churchill, it has some awkward moments. His father, Randolph, played by Robert Shaw, says at one scene, "Oh, what's to become of you?" We know what's to become of him. There's no suspense there. That's the problem with doing a retroactive biography. There's a film, you'll forgive me if I ramble a bit, because it just comes naturally to me. And as I get older, it'll become more natural to me, I'm sure. If you want to see bad biographical films, one that was not a great hit in its time, but they made the Benny Goodman Story in 1955, and Benny's mother, portrayed by Aileen McMahon, is always saying to him, Oh, Benny, don't be that way. Benny, don't be that way. What's the name of Benny's first big hit? Don't Be That Way. Alfred Hitchcock directed a biography of Richard Strauss called Waltzes from Vienna, which may set an all-time record for bad biographical dialogue. I won't try to describe how they created the Blue Danube Waltz. You'll have to see it for yourself. And it's worth seeing for that scene. There are lots of bad Hollywood biographies. Swanee River, where Don Amici plays Stephen Foster. If you want a good chuckle, you might check that one out. But for Churchill, of course, the stakes have been raised as each new prominent actor tackles the part. Chronologically speaking, I'm checking my notes to make sure I'm not getting anything wrong. In 1994, there was a TV movie called When Lions Roared, with Bob Hoskins as Churchill, John Lithgow as FDR, and Michael Caine as typecasting, Joseph Stalin. Almost, but arguably not as unlikely as Robert Duvall playing Stalin in an HBO movie. But, that's what actors do. And some of them, get away with it more easily than others. In 1990, no, I'm tripping on my own things here. I'm going to put one major appearance aside and move to 2002, what I'll call the modern era of Churchill on screen, with Albert Finney. Albert Finney's one of the greatest actors of our generation, and he's known as a chameleon. I mean, this is a man who played Hercule Poirot in Murder on the Orient Express and was not only unrecognizable, but, affected both the sound, the vocal part of that character, but convinced you that he was Hercule Poirot. And then later played FDR in Annie, a film I wish they hadn't made. But I really like the show. That film gets on my nerves. Finney, as I say, is a guy who can convince you he's almost anybody. And he did a good job as Churchill. But I didn't buy it. It seemed too much like an actor playing Churchill rather than being Churchill. And I'm not an actor by trade. I don't know all the lingo, but I know that the goal of most actors is to convince you that that they're not giving a performance. You're actually seeing somebody inhabit or bring to life the character in question. And so to me, Albert Finney, great as he is almost there, but not quite. Again, the makeup is there, the voice, or the approximation of the voice is there, and the film is good. It's called The Gathering Storm. It was done for HBO in conjunction with the BBC. And of course, you have Vanessa Redgrave. For every great actor, there's been a great actress playing Clementine. In this case, Vanessa Redgrave, one of the greatest. But what's funny is if you go to just watch a trailer or a clip of it online, the first face you may see, depending if you land on the same film clip that I did, is a guy who was unknown at the time named Tom Hiddleston playing Winston's son. And it's like, wait a minute, that's that guy Loki from the Marvel movies, which is obviously not your bread and butter, but for millions of others, that's a big deal. So now you have a Marvel villain in the same orbit as the Churchills. In 2009, Brendan Gleeson, another great actor, played Churchill, with Janet McTeer, a great actress, as Clemmy, and Len Cariou as FDR. Again, we're talking about the cream of the crop here. in 2009, Quentin Tarantino, not a historian by trade, as I think he would be the first to admit, maybe the second to admit, cast Rod Taylor, who I always loved growing up, who, by the way, an Aussie, not that that matters anymore, in his film *Inglourious Bastards*, which, again, is more a fantasy than even a pallid attempt at history, as in a very brief appearance as Churchill. Great to see Rod Taylor, maybe not in that part. In *The King's Speech*, which was a wonderful movie, Timothy Spall, another great British actor, played Churchill in a relatively minor part in that particular film. And so it goes, on and on and on down the line. The other great names I'll just mention briefly: Michael Gambon, one of the finest British actors, in a film called *Churchill's Secret*, about his stroke. And that was Lindsay Duncan, a fine actress who's not quite a star to most people, but she's one of the best of the newish generation of actresses. 2018, Brian Cox, who's now playing a paraphrase of Rupert Murdoch on television in succession, played Churchill in a film called simply *Churchill*, about the 96 hours leading up to D-Day, with Miranda Richardson, another great actress, as Clemmy, and John Slattery, good casting. You may remember him from *Mad Men*, as the white-haired, very slender fellow, as Eisenhower. So all of these great, great actors. So why do three on top my list? I'm going to tell you the three that I selected as my favorites, not necessarily in chronological order. First and foremost, to my mind, is perhaps the least celebrated actor, Robert Hardy. Robert Hardy, in the 8-part miniseries *Into the Wilderness*, to me is the best actor I've seen play Churchill. The series, which is not easy to find except if you go to YouTube, where everything now resides online, and where, in fact, we saw that wonderful clip at the Anderson House last night. That was off of YouTube. If you want to stream it, I was not able to find a place to legally stream *The Wilderness Years*, or I could spend $200 to buy one used DVD, which I chose not to do because I found the whole series on YouTube. And what a terrific show it is. It's not great filmmaking. It's kind of stilted to my eyes as filmmaking, but as storytelling, excellent. They had the benefit of noted Churchill historian Martin Gilbert as a consultant and co-producer on the show. But Robert Hardy is the one who really shines, because though he was a character actor and well known in England, he starred on *All Things Great and Small*, a series that many of you may have seen when it played here on PBS. He's had a fine career. He lived to be 91. And he did wind up in 4 Harry Potter films, playing the character Cornelius Fudge, who is the Minister of Magic for the UK, if you're keeping track. To me, Hardy seemed to be the least concerned about the externals of the performance, but he got all the internal things right. He does seem to be Winston Churchill. Blustery at times, petulant at other times, very much in love with Clementine, played by Sean Phillips, but hesitant, repressed in so many ways, really harboring mixed feelings of devotion and, what shall I call it, aloofness, perhaps alcohol-fueled at times, And though they lead separate lives, when he comes to America in the 1930s to do on his lecture tour, he misses her terribly and says so, and says that he misses talking to her. And it's a very touching portrayal of their relationship. There's not a lot of bluster. Of course, it is a younger Churchill, to be sure, but still, there's a feeling of watching a man of great achievement who is still not accepted. Well, that's why it's called the wilderness years, as you could tell me better than I could tell you. But he's thwarted in so many ways, and that's why that period is so interesting to learn about and to revisit if you know it well. He wound up. That also was made for British television, played on American television, and he did so well that he was asked to repeat that role over and over and over again in TV movies like The Woman He Loved, and even an episode of Agatha Christie's Marple, and in a TV movie called Churchill, 100 Days That Saved Britain. So he kind of grew older into the part over the years. He's fairly youngish when he tackled it in 1981. And aging did not harm his career as the man who plays Churchill. If anything, it aided and abetted his ability to do so as the story moved on to its later chapters. The next actor I would name, I'm going to save that one. I'm going to do it in reverse order. Well, Gary Oldman. Now, Gary Oldman has played so many different people on screen. And I called Albert Finney a chameleon. Gary Oldman is not just a chameleon. He's a deeply committed actor. One of his first films that really gained attention on this side of the Atlantic was Sid and Nancy, where he played the punk rocker Sid Vicious, and threw himself into the part completely, though having apparently very little acquaintance with the punk scene. But he's an actor who does his homework. I interviewed him at the time of the John le Carré movie, and he told me he looked at over 100 pairs of glasses to find just the frame he thought was right to play George Smiley. I mean, that's a man who knows what he's looking for and isn't satisfied till he finds it. Because it's not just a prop to him, it's part and parcel of the man he is going to portray. I know something that isn't written about very much, if at all. He was going to play Charlie Chaplin in Richard Attenborough's film Chaplin, and pretty much had the part when Robert Downey Sr. got through to him and said, "You've got to see my son. You've simply got to see my son." So he gave Robert Downey Jr. a hearing, or an audition, or a meeting, and was convinced that he was the right guy. And my wife and I were thinking at the time, I remember we were walking our dogs one night and thinking they'd announced they were going to make a movie about Chaplin's life, and we thought, who could play Chaplin? And we said, well, it's got to be somebody preferably British, again, preferably, slender, agile, with the ability to evoke Chaplin just enough that he would convince you for a span of 2 hours that he was that man. So Gary Oldman was bypassed in favor of Robert Downey Jr., who did a terrific job. I don't think the movie is terrific, but I think he is really, really good in it. But Gary Oldman, I think, would have been his equal, with the advantage of being British. But he says he wouldn't have made the film if, and I want to try to pronounce this right, Kazuhiro Tsuji didn't say yes. That's the makeup genius who designed the Churchill look for Oldman. it took 4 hours to apply every morning and 1 hour to remove. And Tsuji, who has worked on very high-profile films, had left filmmaking. He did not enjoy the process of movie making with the second-guessing and the egos and the hours. But when he read the script for Anthony McCartan's script for Darkest Hour and saw it had the potential to be a great movie, and knew Gary Oldman was going to throw himself into this part, he said, okay, I'll make one more movie with you. He designed them, and Gary Oldman knew his work well enough that he knew that that was going to be the tipping point that would put him over the top and sell us all on the idea that he was Winston Churchill, which he did. Because you can't see that there's any makeup. It's invisible makeup. And that's part of what they're able to do now, what a genius, I think I'll call him that, Kevin Tsuji, is. And he studied with Rick Baker, 7-time Oscar-winning makeup artist Rick Baker, and had the same mentor as Rick Baker, the great Dick Smith, who is best remembered, I guess, for The Exorcist, but who worked on dozens and dozens of films and television shows and is considered a pioneer of modern-day makeup. You remember a film called Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman where he made him look 100 years old? That was Dick Smith who did that, and that was some 35 years ago or so, before new techniques and new materials were available. Having that makeup be invisible allowed Gary Oldman to simply concentrate on acting. And so to me, that's the marvel there, is that through that and through a really fine script, he does become Winston Churchill. In the same way that John C. Reilly and Steve Coogan became Laurel and Hardy last year in Stan and Ollie. And Stan and Ollie are embedded in my consciousness. I grew up watching them every day of my life when they were on local television. And for a baby boomer like me, that was a daily treat to see them. And when I watched these two actors on screen, I didn't see actors at all. I saw Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. That's because makeup has progressed to this, zenith now, just as visual effects have. So to me, it's the two ingredients that make for a great Churchill. Great writing and a great performance. And if either one of those two ingredients is lacking, it can be good, but it's not going to be great. And the proof of that pudding, if you'll pardon a scrambled metaphor, is John Lithgow in The Crown. Because John Lithgow looks nothing like Winston Churchill. And most importantly, he's tall and slim. And when I heard that they had cast him, I said, are they out of their minds? How do you cast a man who looks like that as Winston Churchill? And the answer is, part of the answer is, he's a great actor. And a great actor can persuade you, but only if he has a great screenplay, a great script. That's where Peter Morgan enters the picture. Peter Morgan is a playwright and screenwriter who had enjoyed some success, some modest success, and then he hit on something. It's not a formula, but he hit on an idea that has buoyed his career and made him a major name in both film, on stage, in film, and on television. The idea was write about real people and be willing to write about people who are still alive, which takes a certain amount of chutzpah, to use an old-fashioned British expression, and a keen ear. He's the man who wrote 2 films about Tony Blair and Queen Elizabeth. One of them was made for television. The other one became a feature film. he wrote a film I love called Frost Nixon. First, that was a play, actually. It was a British stage play that then became a really fine film. He wrote The Last King of Scotland, about Idi Amin, and many, many others. And he's the one who created The Crown and has written many of the episodes. And when I went back to revisit just the Churchill material, I was really stunned by how convincing John Lithgow was. More convincing sitting down than standing, or getting out of a car, which they show him doing several times, where they've almost made him a hunchback. They built up his shoulders, tremendously to try to de-emphasize the narrowness of his body. So he's not in the same class as Gary Oldman in terms of the physical appearance. But because Peter Morgan is such a skillful writer, and John Lithgow is such a superb actor, now I can't speak for you folks, I'm sure there'll be differences of opinion, but he persuaded me. And again, that's an actor's job. But he can't do it by himself. He has to have not just the words, but the big picture, as well as the right dialogue, the right motivations, and all of that. And that's what Morgan does so well. Even he has had lessons to learn over the course of his career. I read an article that he wrote for the Writers Guild magazine and then happened to meet him about a week later at an event in Hollywood. And I asked him about it. He wrote this piece about The Queen, the film The Queen, where Helen Mirren played Queen Elizabeth and won an Oscar for it. He said he wrote the part meaning to depict her as being cold. But he admits he didn't reckon with an actress of such skill and nuance as Helen Mirren. And that simply by having somebody like that bring his words to life, she made the Queen seem more human, more empathetic than he ever intended originally. Isn't that interesting? She brought warmth to the character. And he doesn't feel that his work was subverted in any way. It just came as a mild surprise to him. Because he's still learning, as any great artist is. He's still learning, and that's a lesson that he learned most emphatically by having a great actress take on that role. And so with John Lithgow, I don't know what it would be like to read the screenplay, not having seen the actual finished product of the series. But it'd be interesting to compare and see if it comes to life on the page the way it does in the television show. And those are my three favorites. And I would still rank Robert Hardy possibly at the very top of that heap. Heap sounds a terrible word. But on that scale. And that's no disrespect to any of the other exceptionally fine actors who've taken on Churchill. But it is a deep bow to a man who, if not a star, certainly gave a star-worthy performance in a show that is worth revisiting if you haven't lately. And I would like to hear what you folks have to say about this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about this or anything else you care to discuss.
We've got a microphone.
Oh, we're going to pass a microphone to you, apparently. Here it comes.
I have a question. I agree with you basically, but there is one thing which has always disturbed me, and also with Gary Oldman and the darkest hour, and that is when they portray Churchill. There is a type of silliness or quirkiness around his personality, which isn't correct. Also, if you take, you know, the D-Day, he is portrayed as, they don't portray the gravitas that he really had. You know, when you see him in movies or read about him, there's always some, I think also Gary Oldman to some extent makes him slightly silly. At least that's how I perceive it. Also that scene in this tube or subway, you know, why do they make up things which are not correct? The
Well,
reality is enough, sort of.
well, that's why it's good to have documentaries that, that are more devoted to the literal truth. I teach at USC in Los Angeles, and I tell my students, don't get your history from the movies. Even the ones that say based on a true story or inspired by real events, maybe especially those. As soon as you are creating a movie, you're departing from reality because it's a movie. And so even movies with the best intentions and the greatest fidelity to facts are still movies. They're following dramatic structure. They're vulnerable to the whims of a writer or a director or an actor. And you just can't trust movies as a blanket statement. And of course, movies always have to telescope time and sometimes create new characters, create scenes that may or may not have taken place. You know, Peter Morgan in The Queen imagines dialogue taking place between Elizabeth and her husband Philip that no one has ever documented. How do we know what they discuss, you know, when they're alone in their bedchambers? You know, that's impossible to document. But he felt confident enough, and again, that chutzpah comes back into play. He felt confident enough to write scenes like that, let alone, you know, scenes that are less private, that may have had somebody listening in. So movies are movies, and they, you know, they're never going to be reality. It's just the nature of the beast. If something strikes you as silly, as you said, or exaggerated in some way, that's your perception of it. It may not be everybody's perception of it. A hush falls over the crowd. Yes?
Yes, sir. Do we know if Winston, being the cinema fan that he was, ever expressed any sort of preference or guidance for his own portrayal?
I don't know the answer to that question. As we know, he was not averse to building his own character. And no one played Winston Churchill better than Winston Churchill. He was keenly aware of his public image and keenly aware of the power of both radio and movies and public perception. So he lived up to his reputation. Many historians that I've read, you know, say that he was very aware of building a certain mythology about himself. He realized that the cigar and the hat became trademarks, that he shouldn't avoid them in any way. And so, you know, he sort of set the bar pretty high, didn't he? But I don't know that he ever voiced a thought about being literally portrayed by someone else.
Leonard, in your research, you learned a lot about the fact that Churchill loved the movies and some of the movies that he enjoyed. what impressions did you form of Churchill based on learning about what his favorite films were and who his favorite actors were?
Well, I don't know if I dare say this, but I think we had similar tastes. If that isn't too flippant to say, but you know, I like that Hamilton woman too. Not to the degree that he did, apparently. I've not seen it 8 times or more, but I revere Charlie Chaplin. To me, Chaplin is kind of the sort of the fount from which so much of movie history and performance art and silent film, comedy and pantomime come from. So those are 2 instances where I can say Mr. Churchill and I would have gotten along. Again, not meaning to be flippant. No one wants to argue with me? I'm not looking for argument, I was just...
20th century was Richard Burton, and he played Churchill, and in fact he created controversy because he had a New York Times article that appeared on the same Sunday that the broadcast was on, in which he said, "I hate Winston Churchill." And I remember it created a whole storm of response, that article that was in the New York Times. And Burton, what a great actor, and yet, wow, what a terrible portrayal, in my opinion.
Well, yes, he was not at his best when he made that film.
Well, you know, and he didn't try in the way of makeup at all, you know, no shaved head or anything. And at times he seems like he's on some psychedelic drug, you know, as he's doing Churchill's speeches. You know, how is it that such a great actor like Burton can not really get into the part?
Many people feel that Richard Burton drank away his great gift as an actor. And of course, that majestic voice of his, you know, just one of the great voices. And he narrated, you know, that famous documentary series about Mr. Churchill. But by the time he did that performance, he was not in fine fettle, to put it mildly. And that's kind of a shame. That's kind of a shame. So I agree with you completely. Yes. They abandoned the microphone just a moment too soon. Here it comes. Okay.
I'm Celia Lee, and I am a Churchill historian. Now, it's interesting that someone has raised this issue of Richard Burton's acting. And the reason I have asked to speak is that Richard Burton told one dreadful lie about Churchill, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to debunk it. He said that being as he was a Welshman, he was in sympathy with the miners during the Tony Pandy strike, and he accused Churchill of giving the army the order to fire on striking miners. Now, this is a pack of lies. I'm an historian and I researched it. Winston Churchill was at that time Home Secretary. He was in charge of the police, not the army. He didn't give the order to fire, and in actual fact, no miners were fired on and no miners were killed. And it's actually important that that message has got out, because it's gone on in England for years, and it's amazing how many people in high places believe that Winston Churchill gave the order to fire on striking miners. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up and for setting the record straight. Still doesn't excuse Mr. Burton's poor performance, but there you are. David, thank you so much for inviting me here. I've had such a good time. Last night I met so many of you and had wonderful discussions, and you've been very kind in welcoming me. I'm not a history major. I'm a journalist and writer and film critic, but I do have a lifelong admiration for Winston Churchill, and so I'm very happy to be in your midst. Thank you for having me here.